If you were wondering, yes, I am running out of hats. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Sounds Good Makes Sense, a discussion show for the World of Warcraft player. My name is Divalor, and today I want to talk about data mining, especially with Season of Discovery ongoing, and in fact coming up on Phase 3 in, I don't know, probably the next 2 or 3 weeks here, I'd imagine. I've just been seeing a lot more discussion generally around the interwebs of the topic of data mining and what sort of issues it causes and negative effects that it has on the game, but also what sort of positive effects and values it provides to the player. But before we dig into the sort of pros and cons, I think it's important to take a step and just actually define, what do I even mean when I'm talking about data mining? I think most people understand that it's related in some way to finding unreleased stuff, but maybe aren't as keen on the particular details of how that works. And basically, it all just boils down to looking through the game's files to see what's in there. In order for something to appear in-game, it has to exist on your computer in some capacity. It has to have been sent to your computer to actually appear in the game. So usually that means everything that you can theoretically come across in-game exists in the game's files somewhere, with some exceptions, which I'll get to. Importantly, however, you need to understand there are a few things that data mining is not. For one, data mining is not hacking. They're not breaking into some secure vault somewhere. It's literally just a file that's sitting on your computer. And yes, getting into those files can be a little bit weird, and like learning how to read those files can be a little bit weird, but it's not like you're stealing someone's password or bypassing some sort of login credentials or anything like that. It's literally just a file on your computer that you open up and look at. It is also not, and I didn't think people thought this until I was doing some research for this episode, but it is not looking through the game's source code. The data miners don't have the game's source code. It is also quite different from a straight up leak, in which case someone has been given some confidential information and then been careless with sharing that confidential information. Data mining is a very different thing. That's nothing being leaked. There's no like secret information being handed off to Wowhead so they can put it on their website. It's literally just them looking at stuff that everyone has access to. And I can already hear someone saying, well, if everyone has access to this stuff, then doesn't that mean Blizzard wants it to be data mined? And no, not directly. That's not what that means. That's not how computers or really even the internet works. In order for Blizzard to have an alpha, a beta, a PTR, etc., the files for that game client essentially need to exist somewhere. They have to be put somewhere on the internet, so that then they can be sent to the people that they're inviting to this alpha or beta, or to anyone who signs up for the PTR. So those files are just sitting on some server somewhere, and all data miners really do when it comes to like alphas and so on is watch those servers and see when new files appear. Now, yes, technically there are some things that Blizzard could do to make it a little bit harder for data miners to find those files instead of, just uploading them to the same servers over and over and over again. But that would add a ton of work onto the Blizzard team, especially the live ops team. That would add a ton of work for them to deal with all of that. And on top of that, it would realistically only slow data miners down by like a day or two most of the time, tops. It really wouldn't actually have any effect. So not really feasible. They do encrypt some files, which effectively means that they can't be opened by data miners. But again, that would be a ton of work to try to do at a large scale, to the point that it's basically impossible. I'll come back to that. So if Blizzard did want to stop or slow down data mining, what options do they have? And just to mention it off the top, yes, technically there is a section in the Blizzard EULA, the end user license agreement, that prohibits data mining, but it does say that Blizzard can enforce that at their own discretion, which they've been pretty lax about for the last basically forever. And all that really allows them to do is terminate your use of the service, which basically just means banning you from the game. Banning someone from the game doesn't make it so that they can't data mine. It means that they can't log in, but they can still data mine just as much as they could before. They don't need to be able to log in to look through the game files. It's just not how that works. And besides that, even, it probably makes the most sense for Blizzard to stay on good terms with data miners. So the fact that it's against the EULA is kind of a non-point. Another option for Blizzard is to have more streamed content. And I don't mean like watching it on Twitch TV. I mean content that is streamed to the game client once you are logged in and actually playing. You remember earlier when I said that Most things are in the game files, but with some exceptions. The exceptions are things that get sent to the client while you're actually in and playing. They get downloaded to your computer as part of your actual play experience and not as a file that exists ahead of time until the game actually sends it to you. And that can be really good for like small things that Blizzard really doesn't want to be revealed until a moment where you actually come across it in the game, or for things like text dialogue, that you can send a text string from the server to the client really, really easily because that's very, very small. It doesn't take up much of a file size, but it really won't work for things like cinematics or 3D models and so on. Anything that's going to take a little bit of time to actually download that needs to be shown on demand as soon as it shows up won't really work for those, because the game, they have to assume that people are on bad internet connections. And it would suck if someone who is on like a satellite internet connection out in the middle of nowhere kills a boss for the first time and can't see any of the drops because his computer hasn't downloaded them yet. It's also the sort of system that kind of needs a bunch of infrastructure already in place for it to work. Like, I don't think this works in Classic at all. I'm pretty sure that the tech that they need to do that does not exist inside the Classic client. This is pretty much a retail only thing. So something like not seeing the runes until you come across them for the first time wouldn't really be viable for something like Season of Discovery. But that said, there are things that, at least in retail, I would like to see this a little bit more. Like maybe the trading post, for example, could be something where instead of most of it getting data mined ahead of time and like, oh, these are the things that are going to show up on the trading post sometime in the first half of the year or whatever. Maybe we could have more things that's like, okay, yeah, this will be on the trading post like tomorrow, and everyone's client starts downloading it the day before or something like that. But again, as cool as the idea of streaming the data directly to your computer when you first come across it in the game actually is, that still is going to mean that stuff gets data mined as soon as it actually gets streamed to someone's computer anyway. And B, that it really isn't feasible for much of the game. They could consider encrypting more content. The encrypted content is stuff that is already on your computer, but it isn't something that you're able to actually open or see until you get the encryption key that basically decodes it and makes it into something that your computer can open and recognize. That is something that they do for things like cinematics, for example, where the cinematics are encrypted up until the point where you might encounter it in game. And that's something that can work well for short lists of files. Like a cinematic, for example, is one file that exists in the game, and they just say, okay, encrypt that file, and that's fine. If they were trying to do that for large swaths of content, it would be so much more difficult. Like, imagine if they were trying to encrypt a new zone, for example, that they were planning to add in a new patch, and they didn't want people to see it yet on the PTR or whatever. If they were trying to encrypt a whole zone, that would mean they need to encrypt a ton of textures, a ton of mobs, a ton of 3D models, a ton of quests, text, dialogue, so on and so. Like, there's so many different individual pieces to what goes into something like that, that it would be absurd for them to be able to encrypt all of that. But honestly, the biggest question really is, should Blizzard actually care that much about data mining? And in order to explore that, we need to look into the issues caused by data mining, as well as the benefits gained by allowing it to exist. Now, some of the issues I think are pretty apparent. Like, spoilers is an easy and obvious big one, where yes, you could theoretically try to avoid them, but it's not always that easy to actually avoid spoilers. And then, whoops, you accidentally found out something that you wanted to be able to learn for yourself by playing the game, but instead you saw someone in general chat talking about it, or one of your guild members was really excited and mentioned it somewhere or something like that. But I think it's important to recognize just how much damage spoilers can actually do, especially when you're thinking about like narrative and like the flow of the story being told. There have been a lot of cases, for me at least, where I'll talk to someone who did manage to avoid story spoilers, and they didn't see any cinematics in advance. They didn't look up any quest text or anything like that. And they played through the game, and they're like, yeah, I actually kind of liked that story that went through there. It was a little weird in some spots maybe, but I felt like the story was good. But everyone who had looked up the spoilers in advance and watched the cinematics and so on were like, this doesn't make any sense. Nothing here makes any sense. And that is because context is important when it comes to storytelling. A lot of the time, if something someone is doing doesn't make any sense, but you've skipped everything they've been doing up until that point, there probably was something along that way that made it make more sense. Like, here's a non-WoW example. Imagine you were watching Star Wars for the very first time, and you were starting with the original trilogy, as you should. And you've watched A New Hope, and then for some reason you decide to just go watch the last 30 minutes of Return of the Jedi. You'd be super confused and think the story didn't make any sense because, like, why are we destroying the Death Star again? I thought we already destroyed that. Ugh, did they just have another Death Star? That's stupid. Or, why is Luke so upset about Darth Vader dying? This doesn't make any sense. Vader's the bad guy. Ugh, this story is stupid. Like, because you skipped all of the steps up until that point, you're missing out on some key plot points that then someone trying to explain to you afterwards, like, oh, well, he's sad because it's actually his dad. And there's a second Death Star because, like, the whole, like, second and third movie were about how they were building a new one to replace the old one that got destroyed and so on and so forth. As that starts to just be explained to you after the fact, even if it's explained to you by going back and watching these films, it feels like an explanation for a weird thing that you encountered and not a story being told that leads to a conclusive end. I'll throw a quick caveat in there that's not me saying that every single story ever told in World of Warcraft would have been great if you didn't see the raid cinematic in advance. Not what I'm saying. Just saying that a lot of times you might have enjoyed it more than you did if you'd actually seen all the context first. And that lack of context / lack of a cohesive and complete item extends to things beyond just narrative development as well. Like, a lot of times you can hate a feature in advance because you saw, like, the broken initial, like, crappy version of it and not the final version that it was eventually going to end up being. Sometimes it's possible that you might have actually liked a feature if you didn't have such a sour taste from it because of the bad initial version of it that you saw. And the reverse can actually be true as well. And in fact, it's probably a bit more common, where you see, like, the shreds of something and you start trying to put pieces together and figure out what that could be and come up with an idea of, oh man, I bet this is what this thing is. And then later it turns out to be something completely different. And so you hate that feature because it's not what you expected it to be in the first place. I'll give you an example of what I mean. So way back in the vanilla WoW days, before Burning Crusade ever came out in, like, 2006, like, we knew the Burning Crusade was coming and we were starting to learn some things about it, but we hadn't learned much yet. And early data mining had started to exist. There was a member of my raid group who was playing a tank, and he learned that resilience was going to be a thing, but hadn't gotten much details on what that actually was. So for some reason or another, he had gotten it in his head that resilience was going to replace resistances instead of it being the PvP reduced damage thing that it was. His idea of what resilience was going to be was replacing all of your resist sets. And to a tank who is just coming off of Encourage progression and starting to get into Naxxramas progression at the time, the idea of only needing one resistance set was amazing for that person at the time. Like, oh my God, this is going to be so much nicer. I just collect one resilience set and then I never need to worry about my resistances ever again. But as you know, that's not what resilience was. Resilience was instead damage reduction on your player in PvP. And that made him hate not just resilience, but the Burning Crusade in general. Like, he ended up not playing TBC at all because this thing that was never going to be resistance related in the first place wasn't resistance related. Now, you might call that a bit of an overreaction. I certainly would. And I don't know how he got it in his head that it was going to be resistance related in the first place. Like, I don't know where that initial thought came from for him, but it's still a prime example of how you can come to really, really despise something because you thought it was going to be something different and it wasn't that thing. And even if you would not have cared at all that it wasn't that thing, if you had just known what it was from the get-go, the fact that he thought it was going to be this other thing was enough for him to quit playing the game entirely. And the last sort of negative effect of data mining that I'll bring up before we move on to some of the positive effects is just generally the effects that it has on the way the game is designed. Blizzard basically has to design the game assuming that the majority of what they put into every alpha build, every beta build, and so on is going to get data mined, it's going to get posted, and people are going to find out about it. I mean, this is basically why they added the dungeon journal to the game back during Cataclysm, was because prior to that, the way you learned how to kill bosses was by going and looking up the data mining on what every single one of their abilities did. And that put certain guilds at such a strong advantage, knowing what the boss fights were going into the ahead of time, that Blizzard basically had to then put something in the game that brought that advantage to people who weren't looking up the data mined information. Another much more recent example is phase 2 of Season of Discovery. A lot of people have levied the criticism that it feels like everything in phase 2 discovery wise was put in with the assumption that you were going to be looking it up online later on, and wasn't something that people were really expected to be able to find themselves. Now, I'm not fully convinced that that's actually the case. I more think that they just kind of actually just messed it up a little bit in phase 2, and hopefully they don't do that again in phase 3. But I still think it's a fair guess to make as to why it worked out that way, because again, Blizzard does have to design the game assuming that people are going to look up data mining. But all of that said, there are some huge advantages that allowing data mining brings to the game and brings to the general play experience. Like, the majority of the functionality on Wowhead, for example, exists because of data mining. And I'm not just talking about them posting like the new hidden stuff in alphas and betas or whatever. I'm talking about like the ability to look up what a boss drops, the ability to check to see what items even exist, the ability to look up what's needed for a profession recipe if you don't have that profession. Like, these are all things that having data mining existing makes it so that Wowhead can provide that as a service to the player. And yeah, a lot of that could feasibly be done without data mining, and in fact was done without data mining back in the like Thoughtbot Alakazam eras. But it would be way slower, way less accurate, and especially with how much things get hot fixed and streamed to the client these days. Some of the stuff that I was talking about earlier, like it used to be the case back in the vanilla days where things didn't really, like items didn't really change, quests didn't really change outside of a patch, which might have been every couple of months at most. Nowadays, things are getting changed constantly. And the ability to look in the game files to see what those changes are and immediately update these websites makes them so much more accurate and so much more useful to the player than if it was something where everything that occurred, you had to just wait until someone found it and manually updated a website about it. And even looking at unreleased content and things that have yet to come to the game, a lot of the early feedback about things that get seen in like alpha and beta data mining is still valuable. A lot of that feedback is still very, very useful to developers, even if it's like something that they've already kind of decided they didn't like how this spell existed or whatever, and they were already kind of planning on changing it. Even in those cases, it's helpful for them to know that people also would like them to change that spell. And while it's fairly easy to come up with examples of something being seen a bit too early and that being a problem for whatever reason, most cases aren't like that. The majority of cases of something getting data mined is something where it's like, okay, well, this spell has changed just slightly, and people can give feedback on that change if they want to. And having that sort of glimpse at changes and new things being added helps a lot with giving testers some sort of like direction towards the things that they want to go find in game and see how they work. Like, if you see data mining that shows this new item that exists and you're like, hey, that's an interesting item, that makes you want to go and do the thing that gets you that item, so that then you can try that item and see how it actually works out in practice and actually go through and test all of this stuff. There are a lot of players where if they like, they're not going to just go through and check every single tooltip on all their spells and see if things are different. If they didn't know that some of their spells were changed, or they didn't know that this new thing was in this build or whatever, they might never get around to testing it at all. So it does actually, having the data mining exist does actually, at least in my opinion, does provide a bit more of an impetus for people to actually participate and test these things, which in turn helps Blizzard in the development process. And it's also worth noting that seeing this data mine stuff, at least on like a broad stroke spectrum, helps players feel a bit more informed on where development of the game is going. Like, WoW is a huge game, and I can tell you from prior experience doing that, trying to communicate every single change that happens and trying to communicate literally everything that's being worked on at every point in time that's not going to happen. There's no future in which that is possible. So having this sort of like glimpse of here's where things are at right now, this snapshot of like, here is what is changed from the last time you saw an update, does at least help some players get a better understanding of how development on the game is progressing. It's just very, very important to never assume that whatever you see in an alpha or beta is obviously the direct and final choice that Ian himself handed down to exactly how this should be, and this is going to be the final version of whatever it is you see. Obviously, you can still make some assumptions based on how things are working out, and you can look in the broad strokes, like I said. Just try to not panic so much when something seems a little bit weird, especially when it's like the first that it's hit a PTR or hit an alpha or a beta or whatever, because usually that just means they haven't gotten around to iterating on it yet. So circling all of this back and sort of closing the loop on the question of, do I, as a player, think that data mining is ultimately a good thing or a bad thing for World of Warcraft? I think as all of it washes out, it trends towards being a good thing. I think the positives outweigh the negatives. There's definitely examples of things that I wish were not data mined and were. There's definitely examples of things where I genuinely think the public reaction to something would have been more positive if bits and pieces of it hadn't been data mined and presented out of context as a result. I definitely think that's all very true, but I still think at its core, the advantages that data mining brings to the game and the positives that result from having things like Wowhead available to people, that outweighs the negatives that can occur from time to time. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for this episode. I'm starting to get a bit rambly. I can feel it. So we're going to call it good there. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks again to all of my patrons for keeping me supported over on Patreon. If you haven't checked it out yet, patreon.com/Devilor. We got a whole bunch of new perks that I just rolled out. I put out a video a few days ago with a bunch of new perks for Patreon. And I've got some ideas for some other ones that I might try at some point in the near future too. So keep an eye out for that. As always, you can find me on pretty much every social media everywhere as the name Devilor. I try to keep a hold of all of those handles, even if it's not a platform that I'm really using regularly. I still try to keep those handles so that if I decide to use it later, then it's there. Like, I don't know, I'm thinking about trying Threads again. I haven't tried Threads in a while. Maybe I'll try Threads again. I don't know. But you can find me pretty much everywhere as Devilor. The Streamathon is still ongoing. We are about to start day 31 of the Streamathon, and there's at least, I think, 12 days still left on the counter. So that's still going. You can check that out, twitch.tv/Devilor, or I've been streaming it here on YouTube as well, youtube.com/Devilor. You can check it out. That's enough shameless self-promotion for one episode, I think. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you later.